if I told you that everything we thought we knew about power in the Middle East has just collapsed? That for the first time in decades, Israel, long feared, long untouchable, was struck directly by the one nation it thought would never dare. This is not just a military event. This is a turning point in history. A moment where silence was broken, where fear changed sides, and where Iran stood up not through shadows, not through proxies, but with clarity, purpose, and force. This speech isn't just about missiles, it's about meaning, it's about courage, it's about what happens when the most dominant powers are forced to face a challenger who no longer fears them. Stay with us, because every word ahead will pull back the curtain on a story the world isn't ready to admit. A story of boldness, of resistance, of a shift that could change the course of everything we thought was unshakable. This isn't just commentary, it's a warning, a revelation. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why nothing will ever be the same again. Let's begin. For decades, Iran maintained a strategy of indirect confrontation with Israel, relying on proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or militia forces in Syria and Iraq to exert pressure. This approach allowed Iran to project power while avoiding the risks of a direct state-to-state conflict. Israel, in turn, operated under a long-standing assumption Iran would never engage in an overt military attack against it. This belief shaped much of Israel's regional behavior, from airstrikes in Syria to covert operations inside Iran. It was a strategic calculation that enabled Israel to act aggressively without fearing a full-scale Iranian reprisal. That assumption has now been shattered. Iran's recent direct strike on Israel marks a radical departure from its traditional playbook. For the first time, Tehran chose to abandon the veil of plausible deniability and instead claim responsibility for significant military action. The implications of this shift are profound. It signals that Iran has either reached a point of confidence in its military capabilities or a level of provocation and pressure where it no longer sees benefit in hiding behind proxies. Whether it was driven by revenge, deterrence, or calculated political messaging, the decision to launch an open attack showed the world that Iran is prepared to face the consequences of direct engagement. This strike changes the rules of the game. It forces Israel to reconsider its strategic posture and defense protocols. Iron Dome systems may still function, but they are now being tested in ways the public hasn't seen before. No longer is the battlefield restricted to distant borders or intelligence operations. The front line is moving closer. The symbolic weight of this strike is even heavier than its physical damage. It demonstrates that Israel is not beyond reach. The psychological shift alters the regional equation more than any single missile ever could. By choosing to strike directly, Iran also sent a powerful message to its allies and adversaries alike. It showed strength, resilience, and perhaps most importantly, willingness to escalate. This move emboldens its regional network and raises the stakes for future conflicts. It also challenges the international community to respond to a Middle East that is no longer operating under old assumptions. Direct confrontation between state actors in this volatile region was once the greatest fear of many global powers. With Iran's bold strike, that fear is now a reality. Israel has long operated under a core set of strategic assumptions designed to maintain regional dominance and deterrence. One of the most central of these was the belief that Iran, despite its rhetoric and regional influence, would avoid direct military confrontation. This belief wasn't born out of arrogance but of precedent. Decades of watching Iran work through proxies, apply pressure diplomatically, and respond to provocations with carefully measured indirect action. The entire regional power structure leaned on this understanding. It was assumed that Iran preferred to maintain plausible deniability, limit escalation, and avoid being directly blamed on the world stage for large-scale attacks. This belief shaped Israel's defense policies and offensive strategies. It enabled targeted assassinations of Iranian scientists, routine strikes on Iranian weapons convoys in Syria, and the disruption of Iran's nuclear and cyber infrastructure without fear of immediate reprisal. The idea was simple. Iran would never risk full-blown war because it had too much to lose. As a result, Israel operated with boldness, confidence, and the assurance that it could act first and worry later. This created a strategic imbalance, one where Israel dictated the pace and scale of military interactions, while Iran remained reactive and restrained. That balance has now collapsed. Iran's recent direct military strike demolished this assumption in a single moment. By retaliating openly, Iran proved it was no longer willing to absorb attacks quietly or be boxed in by traditional diplomatic constraints. The shock wasn't just in the strike itself. It was in the realization that Israel's long-trusted playbook was now outdated. A critical pillar of Israeli defense, predictability in Iranian behavior, had been pulled out from under them. The psychological and strategic effects of this can't be overstated. It forced Israeli leadership to reconsider how they interpret Iranian intentions, how they prepare their military responses, and how they engage with the broader regional network of allies and adversaries. With Iran demonstrating a capacity and willingness to cross the threshold into open conflict, Israel must now rethink not only its offensive operations, but also the risks associated with them. There is no longer a clear red line that Iran will not cross. That uncertainty introduces new layers of complexity to every decision the Israeli military or intelligence community makes moving forward. What was once a calculated game of chess has turned into something far more unpredictable and dangerous. The balance of power in the Middle East has always been fragile, maintained through an unspoken hierarchy shaped by military strength, geopolitical influence, and international backing. For years, Israel held a dominant position, backed by American support, advanced technology, and unmatched air defense systems. Iran, while influential through its proxy network and ideological reach, often appeared more reactive than assertive. The recent direct strike from Iran against Israel has disrupted that order and signaled a shift in the regional power dynamics that can no longer be ignored. This was not just an act of retaliation. It was a demonstration of capacity and confidence. By striking openly and deliberately, Iran positioned itself not as a hidden force working through third parties, but as a direct actor, willing to confront its adversaries head-on. This is a significant change in posture that resonates far beyond the immediate military engagement. It challenges the long-held perception that Iran is a regional disruptor that prefers to operate in the shadows. Instead, Iran now asserts itself as a central power with the boldness and strength to act unilaterally and openly. This recalibration of image and intent sends a powerful message to both allies and adversaries in the region. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Turkey are now forced to reconsider their own strategic alignments. If Iran is capable of standing toe-to-toe with Israel, the traditional image of regional superiority is shaken. The United States, long the cornerstone of Israel's deterrence credibility, may find its influence diluted as new power centers assert themselves without waiting for Western approval. This dynamic emboldens not only Iran, but also its regional allies and sympathizers, who now see a credible challenge to what was once perceived as an unshakable Israeli advantage. The psychological impact of this shift is as significant as the physical one. Israel, once seen as the untouchable force in the region, now faces a rival willing to match its aggression. This creates a more symmetrical landscape of deterrence, where both sides know that actions will invite consequences and bold moves will be answered in kind. The notion of who holds power, who sets the terms, and who commands respect has evolved. Iran's strike served not only as a tactical maneuver, but as a strategic statement, declaring that it is no longer just part of the regional equation. It intends to help define it. The psychological dimension of warfare often carries consequences as severe as physical damage, especially in societies where national security has always been portrayed as impenetrable. In Israel, a nation shaped by decades of conflict and surrounded by perceived threats, the belief in its defensive superiority has been a cornerstone of public confidence. The Iron Dome, Mossad's reputation, and swift military responses have built a sense of protection and control among the Israeli population. Iran's direct strike shattered not just strategic expectations, but emotional ones. It brought fear into the open, not just among politicians and generals, but in the minds of everyday people who had long believed that retaliation from such a distant and powerful adversary was unlikely. For Israeli civilians, the sight of Iranian missiles flying directly toward their homeland marked a turning point. While Israel has always lived under threat from Gaza, Lebanon, or lone attackers, this was different. This was Iran itself, not a proxy. It was a message that no defense system is infallible and that no one is truly out of reach. That realization introduced a level of psychological vulnerability that is difficult to reverse. It changes how people think about safety, about the future, about whether leadership can still protect them in a rapidly evolving security landscape. This kind of shift has broader societal effects. Families begin to question their children's future in the country. Public trust in institutions weakens. Political divisions widen as citizens debate whether military aggression is worth the risk of direct retaliation. Even the IDF's strength, once considered unquestionable, is now under scrutiny, not necessarily for what it failed to do, but for the false sense of security it may have created. When fear sets in, it travels faster than missiles. It infects conversations, classrooms, social media, and the press, creating an undercurrent of anxiety that persists long after the dust settles. When the dust settles, in this climate, fear becomes a weapon as potent as any strike. Iran's message was not just to the government or the military, it was to the people of Israel. It said, "We are not afraid to face you, and we know how to reach you." That alone alters the calculus of deterrence. A population that no longer feels invincible begins to question not just its enemies, but its own choices. That shift is subtle, but its effects are lasting. The direct confrontation between Iran and Israel has forced a reckoning not only within the Middle East, but across the global stage. For decades, the international community, particularly Western powers like the United States and European nations, have managed the Israel-Iran rivalry through a combination of sanctions, diplomacy, and military deterrence. The assumption was that both countries, while hostile, would avoid direct conflict to preserve regional stability and global economic interests. Iran's bold strike has dismantled that assumption and placed global actors in a deeply uncomfortable position. Now they must choose between escalating involvement or risking their credibility and influence in the region. For the United States, the situation is particularly delicate. As Israel's most steadfast ally, it has historically offered military, financial, and diplomatic support in moments of crisis. However, open Iranian retaliation raises the stakes to levels not seen in years. If the U.S. responds with strong military backing, it risks becoming directly entangled in a wider war that could draw in other regional powers and spark broader instability. On the other hand, if the U.S. urges restraint or takes a neutral stance, it may be seen as abandoning its closest Middle Eastern partner at a critical moment, potentially weakening long-standing alliances. European powers face similar dilemmas. Many have tried to maintain a fragile relationship with Iran, especially in the context of nuclear negotiations and trade interests. A direct confrontation threatens to unravel years of diplomatic work and puts them at odds with either side, depending on their response. They must now navigate a rapidly changing landscape where neutrality becomes nearly impossible and silence is perceived as complicity. Global leaders must now reassess whether their current policies can survive a new phase of open conflict or whether a more assertive stance is required to preserve what remains of regional balance. Beyond Western powers, nations like Russia and China also have vested interests in how this plays out. Both have established ties with Iran and see Israeli-American dominance in the region as a strategic challenge. Iran's strike, therefore, is not just a regional act, but part of a broader geopolitical realignment. It opens the door for these powers to exert influence in shaping the next chapter of Middle Eastern dynamic. The world is now watching more than just a clash between two states. It is witnessing the unraveling of an old order and the uncertain rise of a new one. Iran's decision to strike directly at Israel was not only a military maneuver, but a moral and symbolic act that resonated far beyond the battlefield. For many observers in the region and around the world, this action was interpreted as more than retaliation. It was viewed as a moment of defiance against a long-standing system of perceived imbalance and injustice. For years, Iran has been painted as an aggressor, isolated through sanctions, vilified in international media, and routinely targeted by covert attacks. Yet, its response had rarely escalated to full, open confrontation. When it finally did, the move stirred something powerful in the global imagination. The idea that even the most dominant powers can be challenged. Among certain segments of the population across the Middle East, and even in parts of the global South, Iran's boldness was not met with universal condemnation. It was met with admiration. Not necessarily for the violence itself, but for what the act represented. It embodied the belief that sovereignty matters, that resistance is not weakness, and that fear should not dictate the right to exist or to defend. Iran's strike was interpreted by many as standing up not just to Israel, but to a broader architecture of control that has defined geopolitics in the region for decades. It challenged the notion that power lies solely in military superiority or in global alliances, and reminded many that strength can also be expressed in the willingness to absorb consequences. This shift in perception carries enormous weight. It gives voice to populations who feel marginalized or silenced. It reignites political conversations that had been dulled by diplomacy, and it reframes Iran not just as a nuclear threat or regional agitator, but as a nation acting from a place of pride, strategy, and moral narrative. That doesn't mean its actions are universally praised or without criticism, but it does mean the narrative is more complex than it once was. In this act of striking back openly, Iran forced the world to see it not only as a force to be contained, but as a force to be understood. What once seemed impossible, a direct challenge to Israel's military dominance, has now been proven possible. And that realization alone changes how people view not just Iran, but the potential for others to rise, resist, and reshape the future. In a region long ruled by fear, power, and silence, something profound has changed. Iran's strike was more than a military response. It was a breaking point in history. It shattered old assumptions, exposed vulnerabilities, and redefined who holds influence in the Middle East. For Israel, it marked the end of an era where deterrence was taken for granted. For the world, it was a wake-up call that the balance of power is shifting, and not quietly. This isn't just about missiles or borders. It's about identity, resistance, and the courage to stand up when the world expects submission. It's about realizing that fear is no longer one-sided, and that even giants can be shaken. The future is uncertain, the stakes are higher, but one truth is clear. The rules have changed, and in this new era, voices once silenced are now speaking louder than ever. Thank you for giving your time, your attention, and your heart to this message. May this speech inspire you to seek truth, to question power, and to never underestimate the strength of those who rise against the odds. Good luck on your journey. Stay brave, stay thoughtful, and never stop standing for what matters. Peace, strength, and purpose be with you.